Welcome back, everyone, to the Cross to Crown podcast, episode 84. I'm your host, Josh Copen, joined by our expert in all things, Doug Gooden, pastor, seminary president, ministry director, father, husband, and will also sell concessions at a local baseball game if you need him to. Zoll's here. Zoll's. No, Doug, you were in Nashville. First of all, I got to ask two things. One, so Nashville is two things these days. It is still country, but it's also very hipster. Having been there enough, especially that area of the Gulch, incredibly hipster. So did you go full cowboy or go full hipster on me while you were there?
I am kind of wearing my cowboy shirt just in honor of this podcast. Yeah. For those who are watching on YouTube, it's even got snaps instead of buttons. So
man, that is real manly right there.
If you can envision a massive belt buckle and cowboy boots, then I fit.
Nice. And did you sing karaoke? Did you do?
Didn't, but we did one sing along in a little club. Yeah.
Nice. It's fun, especially during the day. You got the raw artists who are trying to make it. At night, it's all bachelorette parties and cover bands, and it's like I can only listen to Friends in Low Places at every place so many times before I'm done with it. But
actually, when we were there 2 weeks ago for the Christian Missionary Alliance convention, so I was there for that, and then went back last week for the conference, and the bachelorette parties were going on all day during the day as well. We got down in the afternoon, and those party buses where they just drive around, I guess, up and down Broadway there. And somebody told me, one of the tour guides told me that they have to pay like $50 an hour and bring their own alcohol. And I'm thinking, obviously I'm not interested in doing any of that and wouldn't want any of my kids or anybody else doing that. But just even if I were, would you spend that kind of money? I don't understand the attraction, but it was going on all day. I will tell anybody who visits, find some locals. There's some much better music and much better places to spend your time than on Broadway in downtown Nashville.
Sure. Yeah, we found that out too. We were like, let's just go. We found this little breakfast place. They did a really cool brunch, and this band was playing. It was bluegrass, but it was really good. And you just got to find them. You just got to sneak away. But you were there for the Bunyan conference, which was postponed last year. I don't know if they're doing it biannually or not because of COVID. My wife and I went a couple years ago, and it was just a restarted one in 2019. It was kind of to honor John Riesinger. He passed away, so they were kind of paying homage to him. But this one was a little bit more theme related. You guys were going through the book of Galatians. I just want to give a list of some of the speakers. Is Zach, was it Maxie? Is that how you pronounce Zach's last name?
Yep.
Gary George, Gary Scott, Jeff Volker, you, Renee Fry, Tony Costa, Blake White. I believe those are all the speakers. I hope I didn't leave anyone out. And for the most part, you guys walk people through the book of Galatians. Tony did a thing on social justice, which I wasn't aware was going on. I wish I would have paid a little bit more attention to the schedule. And then you did a Q&A. So let's talk about what you talked about, because I know that has caused some, controversy. You might as well be part of the SBC with all your hot takes from Galatians 5:1 through 26. And the take is on, well, if I could understand it properly, I will try and put it in context. Most NCT people do not believe Romans 7, Paul is talking about the normal Christian life. They will, however, say, no, Galatians 5 is talking about the normal Christian experience of the spirit of the flesh versus the spirit of the Lord that is in you. So there's these conflicting issues. You're always battling sin, etc. Is that a general layman's understanding of what most people would hold in NCT to Romans 7 versus Galatians 5, correct?
Well, actually, most NCT people I've run into would see that Romans 7 is a Christian, or at least, Even John Riesinger, first conversation I had with him years and years ago, I called him and said, okay, if you believe New Covenant theology, you're sort of the godfather of all this. How can you see Romans 7 as a Christian struggling to keep the law? I found most NCTers are still in this sort of traditional Reformed view of that.
See, I was the ones I've grown up with at the Grace Chapel Baptist Church in Kingwood, New Covenant Bible Fellowship in Phoenix, were your view of Romans 7. So that's interesting. So I guess we're in the minority. All right. But Galatians 5, why? Defend your thesis, sir. I will be the doctorate sitting here with the board like this. Defend your thesis of Galatians 5.
Now, did you watch my message last week?
Most of it. Yes, I did. And I thought it was really good. I may not have agreed. I don't know if I disagree. But I'm Switzerland. No, but I did watch it. I watched some of Jeff's and a little bit of Blake's, but I didn't get to see all of it. Babies crawling around and whatnot. So
Sure.
yeah.
Actually, Renee Fry had the section right before me. He had chapter 4, 8, I think, through the end of chapter 4.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great setup for mine. So if anybody goes and we'll need to track down those links. They're doing it on sermon audio and video, and I'm sure the PTI website will have links.
Mm-hmm.
So when they get those up, we'll need to let people know about that, because it'll be worth everyone watching. So you should watch Renee's first. Actually, you should watch them all, because they really do set the context for where I was going in chapter 5. Makes sense, right? Cover the first 4 chapters. It gives you some information you need to know to understand chapter 5. So my basic thesis is that we have allowed theologians to define flesh for us. In fact, in the old NIV, chapter 7 of Romans, chapter 5 of Galatians, where Paul uses the word flesh, the old NIV would actually translate it sinful nature. And so when you read that in those translations and you see that we have this battle, or there's a battle between the spirit and the sinful nature, that's going to push your interpretation of what Paul is describing. I think we should keep the word flesh. That's the word Paul chose to use, and he used it on purpose. And I don't think he has in mind simply our struggle against sin, or this predisposition that you and I have to sin. I don't think that's Paul's primary point in using the word flesh here in Galatians. All the way through the book, he is trying to persuade these Gentile Christians, these Christians who came from paganism, didn't know anything about Israel and Judaism and all that. They're pagans. They worship Zeus and all those Greek gods. They come to believe the gospel through Paul's ministry and others. And now these Jews are trying to persuade them that in order to really please God, you need to be circumcised and you need to keep the law of Moses. And these people are being persuaded of that. So Paul brings out the big guns. He is harsh in this letter. He says, I can't believe how quickly you are abandoning the gospel for a false gospel. He says, if anybody comes and preaches a gospel different from the one I preached, even if I show up and preach a different gospel from the one I originally preached, let them be damned. Let me be damned. If an angel from heaven preaches a different gospel, let them be damned. That's all in the context of don't follow these Judaizers into the old covenant, because that's a false gospel. By the time you get to chapter 5, he has made this point in several different ways. Don't go the way of Judaism. Stay with the freedom of the gospel. Then he describes this battle of the flesh and the spirit. I believe he's using flesh in the same realm as circumcision and the old covenant law, rather than our inherent sinful nature.
Okay, so I'll get into what people asked and what the pushback was from the your fellow pastors and friends there. But when he in verse 19, he starts, and then he gets into a list beginning of actually in verse 19, he starts a list of what the works of the flesh are. Would you agree, though, that those are things Christians do have to fight against? Sexual immorality, moral impurity, hatred, strife, jealousy, et cetera, et cetera. So in what you're saying, though, that is not the context of the normal Christian life here. He's saying that's not this is part of what the pagans or what the Judaizers are bringing in. They're bringing back in all these things. I'm a little confused.
Yes.
As obvious by my question.
Yes. So there are 2 different questions that need to be asked. One question is, why are you and I, as Christians in the new covenant, why are we tempted to sin? Do we have any inclinations, any sinful desires that remain? And the answer, of course, is yes. And we must walk in the Spirit and overcome those temptations. That's a different discussion from what Paul is having here in Galatians 5. In Galatians 5, he's not left the context of Jew, Gentile, freedom in Christ. So he is saying, if you Gentiles go under the law, if you are circumcised, you must keep the entire law of Moses. And here's what the law of Moses did to Israel. It provoked all of these works of the flesh: sensuality, impurity, immorality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what it did. Romans 7, he says it very clear. While we were in the flesh, and I'm not going to finish quoting it because we're going to turn there in a minute because that's going to make my point. But he says, while we were in the flesh, all these sins were aroused. So you Gentile, you Galatians, if you go under the law of Moses, you have to keep the entire law. You won't keep the entire law. In fact, what the law will do is it will cause you to commit immorality, strife, jealousy, anger, all of these things, and then you're going to be condemned for those things, and you're going to die and be judged guilty before God. Don't go to the realm of the law. Instead, stay in the realm of the Spirit, and you will walk in joy, love, peace, all those things.
Well, and at the end, I think that might help your point. I don't know. It does say, as I warned you before, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Thinking about 1 John, it makes it clear we will still sin, but if we're in continuous sin over something over and over and over again, then we need to question ourselves. We may not actually be in Christ. That could be an argument in your favor here of that. If someone's constantly doing this, they're not a Christian who's struggling with their faith and this sin problem that they're fighting. They're just sinning. They're just not even of Christ. Now, what do you do with the fruit of the Spirit that comes? We don't need to get into why fruit's singular there. It's another time for another discussion. But why then would he then go and show what the fruit of the Spirit is if it's not a battle of the spirit of the flesh versus God's Spirit?
Yeah, so look back at chapter 3.
Mm-hmm. I keep saying the spirit of the flesh, the works of the Spirit. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fruit of the Spirit. He doesn't say works of the Spirit. It says fruit.
Right.
Yeah. So chapter 3, you foolish Galatians. Those are harsh words. He's worked up in this.
Paul called a jerk by SBC leadership. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Think of that. Somebody has cast a spell, right? Some sorceress has come and cast a spell. Someone's bewitched you. Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Hear the dripping sarcasm there? Just one question. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing of faith? So you see the division, right? You received the Spirit. You are now empowered by the Spirit. Did you receive that Spirit by works of law? No, but by faith in the gospel. That's his point. Next verse. Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, so you began this work in the new covenant, this work of following God and what he's called you to. You began by the Spirit. Are you now being perfected by the what? Flesh.
Flesh, yes.
Does even your Christian Standard Bible say flesh there?
Finishing by the flesh, yeah. Okay.
Yes. So you see, he's got two categories, two groups, two realms. You're in this realm of the Spirit, which you did not enter by keeping some law, the law of Moses here. Rather, you're in the Spirit. So he now has in parallel works of the flesh and works of the law, or beginning with the law, beginning obedience to the law, beginning with the flesh. So again, we're talking realms. We're not talking this psychological or spiritual battle within us. We're saying there's this realm of the Spirit, this realm of the flesh. So in chapter 5, when he says, do not go to the realm of the flesh, do not be circumcised, do not pursue the law, because that's going to arouse all these things that condemn you. Instead, you're in this realm of the Spirit, walk by the Spirit, and the Spirit does not bear immoralities, jealousies, strives, so on. The Spirit bears love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on. Stay in this realm. That's where you started.
All right. And there was a Q&A. I'm curious, did people ask you, did you get pushback? Did you get whatabouts? I'm curious from people who we both love and respect and go, yeah, go to their church if you're there. So what was the pushback against you there?
Yeah, I didn't get any questions in the Q&A, and I understand there were two guys that were discussing this over lunch, but they didn't come talk to me. So I'm curious to know what their debate was. One of the guys, Gary Scott, who also spoke, he said he was there with me. He was persuaded, and another guy said he's always looked at it as the flesh being our sinful nature, and he sees how this fits the context much better. So whoever might be pushing back, they didn't come and talk, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to do that down the road somewhere.
Tweet at Doug Gooden. That's right.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, good. And but I'm sure it was as Pastor Jeff Volker would call it, in-house family discussion if people have issues that they want to talk about. And I think that's a good way to look at it, as Galatians does. I know you didn't preach on chapter 6, but just talking about bearing one another's burdens, do that in the confines of the local church. It's really important that we do that. Okay, so you're going to take us to Romans 7. Is that correct?
Well, before I do that, let me ask you a little pop quiz here. You said you watched my message, right?
Most of it, not all of it. Yeah.
Here comes the qualifier.
It's true, though. Yeah.
So how did I, what was my rationale for why Paul uses the word flesh here? Did you listen to that part?
I did not get to hear that, but I'm going to guess, just basing on how you've talked and what you, is because you're going to take us to Romans 7. It's the same context that he's using. Does it have anything to do with circumcision?
It has everything to do with circumcision.
That's what I thought.
So when circumcision is first introduced in Genesis chapter 17, when God gives to Abraham this rite of circumcision, 5 times in that chapter, he says circumcision of the foreskin of the flesh. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament, same word, sarx, that is flesh here. 5 times. You must be circumcised in the foreskin of your flesh. He says, so that my covenant will be in your flesh. And then it says Abraham he's 99 years old. He is circumcised in the foreskin of his flesh. Ishmael and Isaac are circumcised in the foreskin of their flesh. Over and over and over again. In chapter 6 of Galatians, Blake's passage, he says that these Jews, they don't even keep the law themselves. The reason they're after you and want you to become Jewish is so they can boast in your flesh. Right? It's like a mark on the wall. We want as many people circumcised as possible. So I think the reason Paul grabs that word is to say, if you receive this mark in your flesh, which ties you to the old covenant, it's going to produce this wickedness in you. Don't go that route. At the end of the day, we get to the same place in that walk in the Spirit. You won't do those evil things. You instead will produce these things because it's the fruit of the Spirit. So we end up in the same place. But my concern is, and this is especially true of Romans 7, my concern is I hear Christian teachers use this all the time to say, we all got this battle. The flesh is battling the Spirit. Well, you didn't, I don't think we read this verse, but where is it? He says, verse 24 of Galatians 5, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh. He doesn't say will crucify the flesh, doesn't say should crucify the flesh. It's done. In fact, pop quiz on the Greek, it's in the aorist tense. What does aorist communicate?
Undefined action.
Yes. And it's actually shouldn't be have crucified, because that would be perfect tense. Right. It's crucified. It's done sometime in the past, and we don't know where it goes from here, but the flesh is crucified. It's dead. It's done. It's put to the cross, like the rest of our sin and so on. So we don't want to tell Christians, you gave into that sin, you're struggling with porn or whatever, and man, it's going to be a hard battle until the day you die because you just got this flesh hanging on. I think it was Augustine who gave the analogy that, that old man, that Adamic nature, that fleshly nature is dead, but he's tied on to us. He's wrapped around our neck, and so we're dragging this dead corpse with us through the rest of our life. And think about that. Think about dragging a 200-pound body behind you for the rest of your life, and you just got to walk in the Spirit so that you can make any progress with that huge weight on your shoulders. That's not the imagery I see here. The imagery here is that realm is gone. That thing is done. It's been crucified. You are free from all of that. So walk in the Spirit. So my point is, very practically and pastorally, you're in your own struggles against sin, or you're talking to somebody and they're just, I'm having a hard time. Stop treating my wife like dirt, yelling at my kids, cheating on my taxes, whatever, loving my brother because, the flesh is just really strong. No, you're not in the flesh. That flesh is dead. Walk in the Spirit and you can overcome this.
What would be you did say we still obviously fight sin. We have to. We're not fully sanctified. What's the Edwards quote? Glory is but grace begun, grace is but glory perfected, or vice versa, whatever the quote is. So when we get saved, it's not like sin's gone, but we are we now have a spirit that wants to fight against sin and wants to live for Christ. Where can you run to then, Bible wise, verse wise, exegete wise, to go, yeah, but we do struggle. Here is the verse I can take you to. Because the two that people run to, you have now said, no, those aren't dealing with the human condition of the everyday believer.
Well, I don't need a verse. Every believer knows in their experience, we are tempted. I like to use the word temptation rather than trying to decide what's going on in my heart. I have a new heart. That's one of the gifts of the new covenant, right? A new heart. God has taken out that heart of stone, replace it with a heart of flesh, using the word a little differently there. So I don't need a verse to tell me that I'm tempted to sin. There's plenty. 1 Corinthians 10, is it? Or 2 Corinthians said he will not tempt us beyond what we're capable of, kind of thing. He'll always provide a way of escape. So we know we're tempted. I want to focus on the fact that we have the Spirit of the living God who will give us the ability to overcome temptation. You might go to 1 John, if any of you says you're without sin, you're a liar. But then again, he goes on and says, you can't continue to be enslaved to sin, or else you're not a Christian. And I think looking at flesh as sinful nature actually encourages people to think they are still enslaved to sin. We are not enslaved to sin. You're tempted. I'm tempted. Sometimes I give into that sin, to that temptation. Why? I don't know. Other than, yes, I still do. But what's the benefit of dwelling on that? The benefit is just the more you think about it, the more you think, oh, I can't defeat this. Rather, let's dwell on the freedom the Spirit of God has brought to us and say, okay, I'm going to overcome that temptation next time.
Well, I think to use one of Paul's letters too would be Colossians 3. You've been raised up. You are these things. Like I always come back to when someone talks about how do we deal with sin? I'm like, Colossians 3. Paul says, put your eyes on Christ. You defeat your sin that way. It's not that there's not a time to confront people in their sin, but you do it going, you say you're this person in Christ. You've been raised up. Stop it, as you would say, the old Bob Newhart thing. But it's Colossians 3. If you have been raised up, set your mind on things above. And then it goes and explains, therefore put to death these things. And you can't do that unless your eyes are set on Christ. So right. I always like Colossians 3. As I said, if you focus on the cross, you'll defeat sin. If you focus on sin, you'll feel beat up. So I think it's really good. All right. So Romans 7.
Yeah.
How are you making the correlation here? Now it's Paul. So Paul gets to be Paul's own commentary or commentator. I get that. So go ahead.
Yep. And, maybe we should do a whole session on Romans 7 sometime. So I won't get into all of it, but here's the pertinent part for this discussion. Okay. So Romans 7 begins with, do you not know, brethren, for I'm speaking to those who know the law. So two important things here. One, he's continuing his discussion from chapter 6. This is where most guys go awry, I think, in understanding chapter 7. It's not a new context. The main point of chapter 6 is you are no longer slaves to sin. He says that over and over again. You've died with Christ. You have risen with Christ. You're not a slave to sin anymore. That's the overall theme of chapter 6. Now he's going to narrow in and give that same instruction, same teaching to those under the law. That's why he says, I'm talking to those who know the law. The law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. Then he gives this metaphor from everyday marriage. A wife is bound by law to be faithful to her husband as long as they're both still alive. If she steps out on him while he's alive, then the law will condemn her as an adulterer. If he dies, she's freed from that law to be faithful to her husband because he's dead. Then he brings that home and says, you've all died to the law. Therefore, the law has no jurisdiction over you, just like the law has no jurisdiction over a wife when her husband dies. She doesn't need to remain faithful to him. That's the analogy that he uses. So verse 5 then, while we were, and what does your CSB say next?
In the flesh.
In the flesh.
Yep.
Notice the past tense again. While we were in the flesh, we Jews, we who were under the law, while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. That's what the law did. And we know this, as you will learn as your daughters get older, when you tell them, don't touch that, with every fiber of their being, now they want to touch that because the law said, don't do it. Now they want to do it. Well, that's what the law did. The law said, have no other gods before me. While Moses is still up on the hill receiving those instructions, they're down making a golden calf. Second law, have no graven images. They're making the golden calf. All the way through, they were adulterers, they were idolaters, they were murderers. Israel, their sinful passions were aroused by the law, and Paul describes that as being in the flesh.
Yeah.
Verse 6, but now we have been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we may serve in the newness of the Spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. So same contrast, two different eras. We were under the law as Jews. We were in the flesh, same era, flesh, law, same era. We've died to that realm, he says. We as Jews, we died with Christ. We popped up alive over here in the realm of the Spirit, and that's how we serve. We don't serve the law. We don't serve in the flesh. We serve in the Spirit. Same thing in those two verses that he unpacks further in chapter 7 here, and then in Galatians 5, I think.
Well, you may have convinced me. It's not like I had to be pushed very hard, but you may have convinced me. I think that's really good. And if people want to ask more questions, they can always leave a comment and we'll respond, as you know, we did. And although I'm going to call out our good friend, Joel Sedeke. So he is a apologetics guy. He has a podcast. I think it's called Just Thinking. No, that's the Daryl Harrison. What's Joel's podcast called? Anyway, Joel has a podcast about Christian apologetics. It's really good. But he commented on our YouTube page about the presuppositional one, posted like 5 comments, and then deleted them all. I'm like, I didn't even get a chance to comment back on them. So Joel's a hardcore precept guy. But anyway, he mentioned
we should have him on. We could debate it sometime.
Yeah, for sure. So given the context of Galatians 5, how did you end it then talking about the Spirit? Let's talk about that, the fruit of the Spirit. I've spoken on joy a couple times there in the context. I've heard some people say that the fruit of the Spirit is all tied in with love and everything else falls under love and things like that. It'd be hard to disagree. What do you make of the fruit of the Spirit? Moo's commentary says this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just some of the attributes or what are part of the fruit of the Spirit. How do you look at the fruit of the Spirit when that comes up?
Yeah, so we can set aside that whole discussion about law, flesh. That's old covenant stuff for the Jew, but that's true of all of us, the Jews who are converted and you and I who are converted. We live in this realm of the Spirit, which is wonderful because that same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, he now is transforming us into Christ likeness, which is all these things. And he starts with love because that's what he has already said multiple times. That is the fulfillment of the law. You want to keep the law of Moses? Great. You can do it as a Christian. Love. That's what it was supposed to point the Jews toward anyway. That's the great commandment, right? Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And how do you do that? Well, you love your neighbor as yourself. So the Spirit is bearing that fruit in us. You don't try to, you can't muster up the love more, just love more. It's not like that. You need the Spirit to bear that in your heart. So we need to be praying for that, asking the Spirit for that. When I'm not treating my wife or my children well, when I'm not treating brothers well, I'm not loving them. Oh, I'm gonna love. Okay, I'm gonna love today. No, Spirit of God, I need you to expose where I don't love them and transform me and give me the power to love them well. Joy. I made this comment in the message. We run everywhere trying to find joy. We run to medication, to the next self-help book, to Christian counselors, to friends or whatever. And God may use some of those, but the Spirit is the one who produces real joy. And as I think we talked about this when you did your sermon, rejoice in the Lord always. It's not rejoice in circumstances. It's not rejoice in you, but rejoice in the Lord. That's why we can count it all joy even when really hard times come, because we're not rejoicing in those hard times. rejoicing in the Lord and his good purposes he has.
Yeah, and almost all instances of the word joy in the New Testament are followed before or after about some kind of trial or suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a joy in that comfort. When we talk about peace and patience and kindness and goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, is this list a counter to the list he has just given, or is it somewhat as a separate context?
Well, it's not a one for one, for sure. But if you are manifesting the fruit of the Spirit, you are not going to commit any of those sins that are in the previous list. You're not going to be involved in sensuality and sexual sin because you love the Lord, you love your spouse, you love the other person. You know, I talk to guys who are struggling with porn all the time and say, those people in those videos, those are real people. Now, of course, it's a sin against God. If you're married, it's a sin against your wife, but you're also sinning against that person because you're using their wickedness as a means of your own gratification here. And you're encouraging them to continue to sin against God by, they're making money on this. They're trying to make money. That's not loving them. So you're not going to commit any of those sins. You're certainly not going to commit adultery and drunkenness and envying, all those things, if you're walking in faithfulness and goodness and self-control and such. So it's not a here's the bad, here's the good, right, as though they're a direct parallel, but these are the kinds of things, the fruit of the Spirit are the kinds of things God wants for us. And you can only get there by walking in the power of the Spirit.
Do you think this is an exhaustive list, or do you think there are more fruit of the Spirit, or plural, if I can, to use a different word, they're fruits of the Spirit that might be that aren't here on this list?
I don't think he intends to make it an exhaustive list, although you might have a hard time finding something else that doesn't come back pretty easily to one of these, right?
Okay, yeah. And it's, we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. A Christian is going to, and it goes into chapter 6, right? It's going to love one another and carry one another's burdens. And I don't know, Galatians is such a powerful book. I think some pastors say all roads lead to Galatians. Some will say all roads lead to Ephesians. It just doesn't. Pastors have their favorite books. I think in NCT world, it's easy to see why we love Galatians so much. Back to the conference, there was a talk on social justice with, it was Tony Costa, is that correct?
That's right.
I would imagine, well, why don't you break it down? I didn't get to see it, so I don't want to put any words into his mouth. So go ahead.
Yeah, he did 2 sessions and they were both really good, very high level. So he didn't really dig into the weeds of what socialism is and critical race theory and that kind of thing. But he brought in example after example after example of how in his country, Canada, and here in the US, this is infiltrating the culture. And I appreciated the fact that he said more than one time, this is an attack against Christianity. When I did our Understanding the Time series last summer, and I would recommend anybody who's not jumped into this to go through that sermon series, that was the point I was trying to make. We're not right-wing Americans here. I didn't do a whole sermon series on this, and Tony Costa did not do 2 sessions in the Bunyan conference because we're trying to preserve some political perspective. This is not about politics, at least not for me, and I don't believe it's for Tony either. We need to understand that Marxism and cultural Marxism and socialism and CRT and all the other feminism, all the other strands of this, they are out to destroy the church because they understand better than most Christians do that what holds Western civilization together is the Christian worldview. And so they are out to undermine the Christian worldview because they do want to destroy Western civilization, and the left wants to destroy the right wing of politics. Well, I don't care so much about the right wing of politics, but I do care about standing for the truth of Christ in the midst of an enemy that is trying to destroy Christianity. I get my marching orders for that from 2 Corinthians 10. Taking every thought captive. That's not you and me making sure our mind doesn't wander where it shouldn't. That's in the ideological realm. He says all these truths that set themselves up against the knowledge of God, we're to take them captive with spiritual weapons. Well, that's what Tony was doing. And he was emphasizing how they're out to destroy the church. We need to stand for truth and watch out for all these different ways in which CRT and socialism is infiltrating our cultures.
What do you make of what's happened in Canada with a couple of the pastors there? And it's COVID related, but I took COVID seriously. I think people should have. I don't, this is a time for another discussion, but there seems to be some CRT, socialism, Marxism related into the COVID response. And I think it's pretty obvious now. What do you make of the pastors that have been arrested for just wanting to hold church? There's a lot of people in American churches who are prominent leaders who are saying this is a persecution. They should just follow the rules, blah, 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 blah. I'm struggling with how it's not being persecuted. They're following God's word. They're wanting to meet. They're wanting to preach. And I also think it's an insult to the churches who are having to meet underground, who will be killed for meeting, to sit here and say these people aren't being persecuted either. So what's your take on what's going on in Canada?
Yeah. So going back to March 2020, when none of us knew how bad COVID was going to be, and people were saying this could kill millions and millions of people, we chose to obey the instruction to not meet together, not because the king said it, not because the governor said it or the president said it, but because, even if they hadn't said it, if there's this disease we think could kill millions, it's best to play it safe and see where this is going. Here in June 2021, if all the restaurants are open, and I haven't had to wear a mask, at least here in Colorado, for quite a while now, except on the plane. They're still policing this like crazy, but everything else is open. In Canada, they're not, but it's really hard for them to base this on any fear that this virus is going to kill millions and millions of people. So to me, I don't see how you get around it. It's religious persecution. They're not going, that I know of, they're not going and shutting down Muslim worship or any other gatherings. It seems to me like that is Christian focused, and therefore, yeah, it's persecution. And I applaud those men who are willing to suffer the consequences of holding their meetings.
Well, they didn't seem to mind hundreds of thousands of Montreal Canadiens fans pouring into the street to celebrate hockey, or the protests last year here in America. But, how dare you meet at a church? Just by definition, to me, that's persecution. It doesn't mean you have to be put in jail or beaten. I think if you look at Paul's context, at times he was persecuted. He was thrown in jail just for preaching. That was it. He wasn't, there were times he was beaten, certainly, but other times he was just arrested for preaching. That's persecution. So.
And a year ago, last June, July, August, in that time frame, I might have said, guys, there's still so much uncertainty here. Don't push it. I mean, we met early. We met last June. We started meeting the first Sunday of June. In fact, it might have been the last Sunday of May. I forget. But I know there were a lot of churches that weren't open that soon, and I don't judge them, fault them for that. There was still, in my mind, some uncertainty. Nowadays, I don't see it. And so I guess my point is, there's a time in which standing firm and, we're going to meet anyway. I don't know, just the witness to the world. I think there's a reason to say, what witness are you sending? What message are you sending today? I think they're doing exactly the right thing. And I hope, we need to pray for them, pray the Lord will sustain them. And as Tony Costa said, he said, brothers there in America, this is coming south. And the way you guys are going is coming
always
down here,
starts Canada and comes south. We'll be praying for them. And and I recommend there's some books out there, your sermon series, which is available. Is it on the church site? Is it also available on crosstocrown.org?
It is. Yeah. It's called Understanding the Times. It's on the Cross to Crown website and YouTube
and
page.
then I've read Voddie's book. I highly recommend it. The Fault Lines book. And then Owen Strachan has a book coming out. And so I would recommend getting that. These are two faithful, wonderful men of the Lord. Also, Owen's pushing for a debate between Abram X. Kennedy and Voddie. And I'd love to watch that.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
So, yeah. Well, Doug, next week, what do you want to talk about? Your singing, your karaoke? What do you want to talk about?
It's a good question. We'll have to give that some thought.
All right. Well, Doug, thank you very much. As always, crosstocrown.org. If they are interested, Doug and I brought up the Greek a lot. They can check out the New Covenant School of Theology.org. They can tweet him at Doug Gooden. I'm at Josh Copeland. And all the podcasts are available, even the ones you did with that other guy who thinks he's cool. He's so tough, can't even hang in California with all those snowflakes. He's talking about moving. Anyway, Chris Fails, those were really good. There's a lot of good stuff in those as well. So, all right, Doug, as always, let's leave people encouraged, really based on what you talked about today. What should people be doing with their lives?
Yeah, I think the book of Galatians and the whole New Testament says we are to live intentionally Christ obsessed in all things.